Okay, this is on. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the 31st Ruth Kennedy Memorial Lecture. It's my pleasure as the president of the Maxwell Museum Association to introduce Dr. Beverly Singer, who is a professor of ethnology here at the University of New Mexico, and she in turn will introduce Sean. So I know we're in for a real treat to hear his research, and I know it's been a lot of hard work for you, and we get to benefit from your labors. Beverly?
Thank you. All right, thank you. One of the real gifts of being a professor at the University of New Mexico is the student body that we have here in the Department of Anthropology. They are incredible. Our students are remarkable, not only in the research that they're doing, but in their outlook on what the future of anthropology is. And so I came to make my acquaintance with Sean when he arrived here. And he wanted to take a look at identity and Native people. And I looked at him and I said, I wonder what tribal affiliation he is. Couldn't quite match up where he was from, but it came to me that he was in search of it, and that's why in his search, I think he has found some answers, which I'm really excited about. But the other thing I wanted to say was that, this is the 31st lecture of the Ruth Kennedy Memorial Lecture, and I was looking back on the internet. What was happening 31 years ago? And I just make this quick kind of survey, and I said, well, that Reagan and Margaret Thatcher were in office. That was in the 80s. And we've come such a far way, from that period, 31 years ago. But I think also that what was important was that I was looking for Native history, and Sean is going to be talking to us today about the Choctaw Nation, Choctaw Mississippi people. And there's a very well-known tribal leader who was in office for, I think, practically 34 years of his life, Philip Martin. And, he certainly had there are many stories about him, but, Sean is only going to take a slice of looking at various aspects of Choctaw. But I want to thank all of you for coming here today. It's just a wonderful opportunity that we have to allow our very best students to be awarded this great opportunity to share with you their research. Thank you.
I think I'll turn that off. Can everybody hear me fine? Okay, yeah. You know what else was happening 31 years ago? I was being born. So I think I'm going to leave the lights up like this if everybody can see the slides, okay? Yes? All right. So Halito, Hachima Chukma, Sahachifa Yashan Gantt, Charlotte, North Carolina, Sialilthi, Chata Ish Satia, Chata Iskatinia Numplili, University of New Mexico Anthropology Department, Hakloli, Yakoke Himaknetak Hashminti. So hello, my name is Sean Gantt, and I'm a PhD candidate from the University of New Mexico in the Anthropology Department. Thank you all for coming, first of all, and thank you to the Anthropology Department and to the Maxwell Museum Association for this award and having me. The title of my talk today is Kata, Hosh, Chahta, Who is Choctaw? Identity and Belonging in Mississippi. Before I begin my talk, I'd like to take just a brief moment to simply acknowledge and honor the indigenous lands that we currently are occupying. And also, I'd like to take a moment to say Chapisalachi to all my friends back in Mississippi who will be watching through YouTube, hopefully later next week. So that's what the camera is there for. So, first off, I want to give you a little overview of where we're talking about. I don't know how familiar everyone is with Mississippi and the Mississippi Choctaw, but you can see here we've got a map of the state of Mississippi, And then these counties that are highlighted here are the different counties in Mississippi where there are Choctaw reservation lands. And so here you can see a blow-up of the main cluster of communities that's up around the Philadelphia area. And one thing I do want to point out is that most of the communities are kind of surrounding the central community of Pearl River. And Pearl River is where all the administration buildings and all the tribal government facilities are housed. Another thing to point out is way down to the south, a good hour or two down south, is the community of Bokhoma. And so you can see it's pretty far away from the rest of the Choctaw communities. And so keep that in mind because Bokhoma will come up a little bit later. So I want to also tell you a little bit more about the tribe. So like I said, my dissertation research is with the Mississippi Band of Choctaw Indians. The MBCI is a nation of approximately 9,500 individuals who reside in those 8 distinct communities that I just pointed out in East Central Mississippi. The MBCI is the only federally recognized tribe in Mississippi, and it's one of the state's largest employers. So, the MBCI is highly regarded by other Native American tribes as both successful entrepreneurs and for retaining their tribal identity and traditional culture. And since about 1970, the Mississippi Choctaw have initiated many different economic enterprises ranging from manufacturing plants to resort development, owning and operating a diversified portfolio of manufacturing, service, retail, and tourism enterprises. And as Beverly pointed out, Chief Martin was really the one that got that whole ball rolling back in the early 70s. And you can actually see him up in this photo cutting the ribbon at the town center. It's like kind of like a strip mall where they have some shops and there's a Piggly Wiggly and some other things like that. But that was really important because there weren't any businesses like that on the reservation. And so every time people would make money, they'd have to go to Philadelphia to buy things. So their money would be flowing out of the reservation community. And this creates a multiplier effect where they keep the money in the community and it goes back into tribal businesses. So it's really important. Up here you see an old photo of the original wiring harness factory. The Choctaw manufactured wiring harnesses for GM for a while. They were doing the wiring for the stereos for the cars. Also, they had a greeting card factory with American Greetings, and they handmade or hand-finished the greeting cards. That was another big business. And over here, you have the plastic injection molding factory where they made cutlery like forks and knives for McDonald's and other things like that. And then more recently, they've expanded the industrial park into what they're calling the tech park now. And they're moving more into kind of high-tech industries. And if you've ever seen the little robotic devices that the military uses to detonate bombs and things like that, the Choctaw actually make those. So they kind of expanded their wire harnessing business into other more high-tech wiring apparatus. And they are also starting to get contracts to do some wiring harnesses for Black Hawk helicopters for the military as well. They've also expanded into resort development, and they now have in operation 3 different casinos. The first one was this one here, Silver Star, and then they added the Golden Moon, which is right across the street. So this is now what's called the Pearl River Resort Complex. And then remember I mentioned Bokhoma. So down south in Bokhoma, they just created this new, much smaller, but this brand new casino. And so they actually built that while I was there. And so it was interesting to kind of see the negotiations around that, especially with the state of Mississippi and Governor Haley Barbour, which we can talk about outside of this lecture. So anyway, so they've been involved in all sorts of different economic development programs. And that's really one of the reasons that I wanted to go there, because they've had this long history of working within economic development. So my dissertation title, Nanta Hosh Chahta Imi, What are Choctaw Ways? Cultural Preservation in the Casino Era, focuses on the long-term impacts of tribal economic development programs and their influence on Mississippi Choctaw identity and tribal cultural preservation efforts. So that's the overall project, what I'm looking at. For this talk today, I'm going to be talking about a much more narrow subject. For those of you that have seen me speak on my dissertation research before, some of these themes in this talk should be familiar. In the past, I've presented on Choctaw history, definitions of tradition and traditional cultural practices, and conflicts over cultural preservation efforts. This presentation will focus on topics related to identity in contemporary Native American studies, highlighting the importance of Choctaw language use as an identity marker for MBCI tribal members. This presentation will attempt to address the following questions. So who counts as Choctaw and what factors influence inclusion or exclusion from Mississippi Choctaw identity? And also, what forms of knowledge about identity and belonging are embedded within local Mississippi Choctaw communities? So first, let me define a term. In my work with the MBCI, I am attempting to develop this concept of epistemology of belonging, which I define as the study of knowledge related to issues of identity and group inclusion or exclusion. So that's kind of what I'm going to be talking a little bit about today. So, turning to some current topics and areas of research within the broader category of Native American studies that either touch on my research or that I'll be kind of referring to in the talk today, I see a couple of different areas that intersect with my research. The first is research around the topic of blood quantum. And so within that topic, I see, or within that area, I see topics such as tribal enrollment criteria, identity policing and disenrollment, which has become, unfortunately, a very important thing to look at now, and alternative conceptions of identity. So people that are proposing alternative models to the blood quantum system. Thinking here of Ava Marie Guret primarily. Also, the area of cultural preservation. And so there's a lot of work being done on things like language revitalization movements and how that's working and ways to do that, you know. Also, cultural arts. And then something I think that gets overlooked sometimes, cultural values. And then the other topic that relates to my research, maybe not what I'll be talking about too much today, but in other parts of my dissertation, is this idea of pan-Indianism, or the pan-Indian movement. So one of the things that I'll be talking about in my dissertation is comparing the idea of local belonging, so like tribal-specific identity, versus a pan-Indian or a broader identity, similar to what Renato Rosaldo refers to as cultural citizenship. So in my dissertation, I'll be getting into talking about some of that as well. So, Nanta Hosh Chahta Emi. What are Choctaw traditions? What are Choctaw ways? Well, I've got a couple of quotes I'd like to read from some friends in Mississippi. Lucy Morris, an elder with the Mississippi Choctaw, said, "Because of what we wore during the olden days, and we were told not to lose this way of dressing, or this way of making things, and language too." Another tribal member said, "A tradition would be a practice, something that's been done over the years, because anything can turn into a tradition if you just keep doing it long enough. That practice gets passed on to the next generation. That's when it becomes a tradition. You can have a personal tradition, but when it becomes a group tradition, it gets passed on." So there's a couple of things. These quotes illustrate a couple of different points that I want to make. First, for most of the Choctaw people that I talk to in Mississippi, the idea of the traditions being passed down from generation to generation was basically the first and foremost thing that they would say. Like, that's what makes something traditional. But then also, I think that these quotes illustrate that there's a necessity for the preservation of those cultural arts through practice also. That these things have to be continually done for them to remain a tradition. And then also this idea that it has to be shared with the group. So when it becomes a group tradition, when the whole group does it, or when most of the group does it, then it becomes a tradition. So these are kind of some of the ideas that I heard in talking with people in Mississippi about how they conceive of what makes something traditional or what is tradition. Which, you know, sometimes we take those things for granted unless you actually talk to people about them. So my approach to defining the traditional cultural practices, what I'll refer to as TCPs, used in my research was based on grounded theory, and that my methodology was to collect ideas about what counted as TCPs directly from MBCI tribal members. I also seek to engage in what Eva Marie Garrett calls radical indigenism by discussing and explaining Choctaw culture by using an analogy to the traditional beaded Choctaw sashes. So you can see up here on the slide, this is an old historic photo of a Choctaw family in Mississippi, and you can see that these guys are wearing these crossed sashes, these beaded sashes. And so you can see some more recent examples of those here. And now that's something, when you look at the old photos, it's almost always people have these beaded sashes on. So it's a really old form of cultural art. And you can even trace it back to prior to European contact. If you look at the Mississippian period pottery, you see the same design, the same scroll design that shows up in the beaded sashes much, much later on. So for a lot of Choctaw people, they say the sashes, that's the oldest, the most traditional thing. So that's the reason I chose that to try to make this analogy for trying to figure out some kind of way, trying to follow Dr. Garrett's ideas of how to talk about these things in that kind of way. So this is the analogy that I'm still trying to work on, but this is where I'm at now. So Choctaw culture is like a traditional beaded sash, where each color of bead is a different cultural activity. For example, stickball, dancing, basket making, and so on. The thread is social and community cohesion as expressed in cultural values, such as the Choctaw concept of eakoa, or sharing and generosity. And the pattern or the design itself is tradition. In effect, new colors of beads can be added and older ones removed, and the design can change over time with the infusion of new ideas, but it's still a Choctaw beaded sash, if only in a new or slightly modified form. But what happens if the thread breaks? Without the foundation of social and community cohesion as expressed through cultural values, the entire object falls apart. So I'm trying to use this analogy to the beaded sashes to talk about the whole Choctaw cultural system and how it works together. Hopefully that makes sense. So, talking about these traditional cultural practices, these are all the different categories of things that people mentioned in my interviews that they saw as traditional or cultural. And not that we need to go through all these, but first and foremost is Choctaw language up here at the top, which is what I'm going to be talking about. My methodology was basically in the first round of interviews that I did with each of my participants, we sat down and did a free listing or a brainstorming activity where I tried to get them to think about and list out as many different of things that they saw as traditional or part of Choctaw culture as they could think of. And so that's where I got all the TCPs from, was from that free listing exercise. And then when we finished with that exercise, I asked them to try to rank them as far as what was most important to them. So we would start with what's most important to you. And often that was Choctaw language. If you can see over here, Choctaw language is the first category. And the blue bar represents the number of occurrences, so the number of people that mention that particular category. And the red bars represent the average ranking that category got. So the lower the red bar, the more important it is. The closer to 1 it is, the more important it is. And the larger the blue bar, the more people mention it. is basically all this is showing. But so what you can see then in looking at Choctaw language is everybody, every single person in my research study mentioned Choctaw language. And pretty much everybody listed it as and ranked it as number 1 or number 2. So we can see that obviously Choctaw language is very important to MBCI tribal members. On this graph, I just, I'm charting out the correlation between the number of occurrences and the average ranking. All this is really here to show is that there's a very strong correlation. There's a highly significant correlation with a p-value of 0.005. And so basically what that allows me to say is that the more people that mention something, also the better it was scored with the ranking. So I can say the more people mention something, the more important it is. And that allows me to kind of hierarchically list this list of TCPs, and I can actually give that back to the cultural preservation program and say, look, these are the things that people think are most important. So that's all that's really there to show. So moving to Choctaw language. So obviously from looking at those charts, we see that Choctaw language is very important to Choctaw people. Another thing I want to point out here is that how many people knew that Choctaw was the first native language used as code for the military? It was used in World War I. It was actually what led the military to think about even using another language, which was Navajo in World War II. So that's something that most people don't know about, so that's some fun trivia for you. And then, so I've got a couple quotes I want to read from participants talking about the importance of language. So my friend Brian said, when I was growing up, they used to tell me, I would say hi or speak to them in English. I understood some of these older people didn't understand or didn't feel comfortable speaking in English for the fact that they would say, what do you think you are? You're talking to a Choctaw, so speak to me in Choctaw. They say, you're not supposed to talk that way. My parents said, you're supposed to talk to them in Choctaw. The elders that I come across, so many of them, I learned it was just easier to relate to them in the traditional language. So I think something that he's bringing out here that's really important is that in Mississippi at least, speaking Choctaw is important for all sorts of different reasons, but it's also important as a sign of respect. And when you're speaking to elders, you're supposed to come to them speaking that language. That's a show of respect first and foremost. Another person said, so to me, language and people couldn't care less if you're a dancer or a stickball player or not, but I think somehow the language makes you Choctaw. I think if you can speak it, if you can understand it, somehow that still makes you what a Choctaw is supposed to be. I think the other things are just the intangibles that reinforces your Choctawness, I guess. I think if you ever needed that one basic identity, it's always going to be your language. And then another person said, your identity is your language. To me, if you can speak it, you have, whether modern Choctaw or past, your tradition has linked that language that identifies you, who you are. And the customs and so forth are secondary and comes along with it, you know. So I think these last two quotes really strongly emphasize this idea of linking identity and Choctaw language. And so that's something I heard over and over again from people when I was conducting interviews and just hanging out talking with friends. So, all right, so moving to our first research question, at least for this presentation. Kata, Hosh, Chahta. Who's Choctaw? What factors influence inclusion or exclusion from a Mississippi Choctaw identity? So I've got five main kind of factors that I'm going to talk about here. I'm sure there's more than that, but these are the ones that I wanted to bring up today. So again, Choctaw language skill, obviously we've covered that. That's very important for identifying yourself as Choctaw. Also, blood quantum and your tribal enrollment status. The Mississippi Choctaw have one of the highest blood quantum criteria of any tribe in the nation. Their regulations say that you have to be half or full to be enrolled in the Mississippi Band. So that's a question that comes up often in talking with tribal members. especially since, you know, a couple of generations, and then, you know, the kids are no longer able to be enrolled. So it's an issue that comes up quite a bit. Also, participation in Choctaw culture, so cultural arts, community events, things like that, also was often mentioned. Then also family ties and residence. So if you know where your family's from, or you can say, my family's from Bokchito, or you still live in Bokchito, for that matter, that is also very important as a factor for being identified as Mississippi Choctaw. And then going along with that is community affiliation or involvement. So that's more the idea of actually being active in the community and taking part in community events and things like that. So I'd like to turn to a couple more quotes to illustrate some of these points. So Daniel Belle is a young guy. He was about 22 when I was doing the research, so he's probably 22, 23 now. He said, if they look at you and say you're Choctaw, then they're going to speak to you in Choctaw. And like me, I'll end up letting them know that I don't speak that much Choctaw, but I can catch on, and they'll be like, well, you got to learn. So there's this idea that it's being reinforced by people like, well, if you're saying you're Choctaw, well, you better learn. You better learn how to speak. Even if you're full blood and grew up in Bokchito, you better learn how to speak. Talking about blood quantum, Melford again said, to me, if they're Choctaw, I don't know how to say it. It's what we've experienced, what we've lived through. I don't know if somebody that only has a small amount of blood say, hey, I'm Choctaw. Have you lived the Choctaw way and experienced the Choctaw things? I don't know how. I guess in some ways your blood does kind of make you what you are. I think Choctaws probably kind of use that too in their thinking. You haven't gone through what we've gone through. So I think this actually illustrates a really interesting point that is maybe kind of specific to Mississippi, but not necessarily, which is being native in Mississippi is not necessarily the easiest thing in the world, and they've had to deal with prejudice and racism to this day, you know, pretty serious racism. So part of this, I think, is what he's saying is, well, if you don't really look Choctaw, then you haven't had to deal with the kind of stuff that we've had to deal with, so that makes you less Choctaw. And talking about participation in Choctaw culture, my friend Dan said, my grandpa told me one day, if you don't speak your language, the white man will try and take away your land, or the land that was where you stayed. And so in keeping with that, I think that we should keep bringing back, reviving everything that we know as Choctaw, and finding out more, and so that we can still have that, and keep our identity. And so Dan is really active in the community. He runs a Boy Scout venture crew, and he's very active in the community with kids and trying to get kids interested in taking part in Choctaw culture. So this whole idea of reviving and bringing back, he talks a lot about that. So again, you have to participate in the culture to keep it alive. You got to take part. Talking about family ties and residence, another guy said, I know who I am. I know where I'm from. I know where my identity goes back to my family, you know. If you got with my family, they're going to tell you, I'm Choctaw. That's their pride. I am Choctaw. What's that mean? It means that I can speak. I've lived it. I don't have to necessarily dance, but I know where I'm from. I know what my family is. I know what we speak. But the thing about it, I know enough. I have enough to say I have identity. So again, he's referring to the family very strongly here. And I think for a lot of Choctaw people in Mississippi, that is kind of the root of your identity, is your family and your language. So the other point that I wanted to make that's kind of in relation to the family ties is about the community affiliation. And so I mentioned a little bit about that, but just to point a couple of things out, in each of the Choctaw communities in Mississippi, there is an elementary school, a tribal elementary school in each community, and there's also what they call a facility building. It's essentially like a community center kind of in each community. So basically, in each community, there is a development club, is what they call it. And it's kind of like a social organization, like civic society kind of organization that holds events in the community, in that community center, and kind of organizes things like feasts and all kinds of different activities like that for each community. So that's going to be important when we move to talking about this next point, which is, I think, to really understand what's going on with all the community affiliation stuff, you have to understand the history of how the tribe was organized. So historically, the tribe was actually broke up into 3 districts. This is prior to removal. And so here I've got a map, an old map of some historic village locations. And so basically the way it was you had a western district, an eastern district, and then all the villages and towns to the south were a part of the southern district, or the 6 towns. And so there was no paramount chief. There was no, well, in Choctaw you say Minko, is like leader. So there was no like one person that was over the entire nation. It was broken into 3 districts, and each district had their own Minko. So when they had to make a decision that affected the whole nation, the 3 district leaders would come together, talk it out, and try to resolve it and come up with a solution. Within each district, though, it further was broke down into the village and town level, where each town basically had a local Minko who was kind of in charge of everything in that town. And so they were left, I mean, to some extent they were kind of semi-autonomous. Decisions that had to do with just that town, they made in-house. They didn't have to go to the higher levels of leadership. So it's important to understand that there's always been this kind of community autonomy to some extent. And the other thing to point out about the villages and the towns too is, especially moving forward in time till now, to some extent each town is kind of seen as a iksa or a clan. So like for instance, if you say, well, I'm from Bokchito, that means that I'm more than likely related to most of the people that live in Bokchito, because it's kind of like that. So like each town is kind of like a clan or a very extended family structure. So like sometimes, especially in the past, they would say you have to marry somebody from another town. You can't marry somebody from your town. So that's important to keep in mind when we're thinking about this idea of community affiliation and why it's so important that you represent your community, which is what I'm going to move to now. And I want to talk about these markers of community affiliation through the lens of the annual Choctaw Fair. The Choctaw Fair happens every year in July, and it's a week-long event, and really it's a combination of all sorts of different events. In one sense, it's a homecoming. That's probably the one time, or the major time throughout the year where the whole tribe comes together in one place to celebrate. And a lot of times people that have moved away and live wherever in LA or wherever will come back for Choctaw Fair. And so in some sense it's kind of a homecoming. Also it's a cultural celebration, because at the Choctaw Fair they do cultural activities like social dancing, basket making, and all those kind of like cultural, they do like demonstrations, like cultural demonstrations, and there's a lot of social dancing that happens at these fairs. Also, people are there making baskets and making beadwork and also selling it as well. So there is an economic aspect to the fair, most definitely. Every evening they have entertainment. Usually it's on the main stage, and they usually have big name country acts come in and perform. And that's partly to get non-Choctaw people from the local area to come in and buy things and spend money. And so a lot of times they'll have big name like Travis Tritt and people like that. It was interesting. I'm not a big country person, but they also had gospel acts, and then they try to have, every year they try to have at least one native or indigenous act on one of the nights. So they've had a couple of different people while I was there. They try to at least have one. There also is like a carnival midway with rides and games and all those kind of things. And then the main highlight of the Choctaw Fair, at least in my opinion, and I think to most Mississippi Choctaw people, is the World Series of Stickball. And so that happens every night after the entertainment, and sometimes the games will go till 1, 2 in the morning. But everybody's there. All the Choctaw people are there watching the stickball matches, and it's a very big deal. And actually, one of the things that's really interesting is sometimes everybody, like most of the Choctaw people, will leave and go up to the football stadium up at the high school where the stickball matches is before the end of the entertainment. So you have some big name country act down there playing, and everybody that's down there watching the country act is primarily white, and then you go look up at the stickball field and there's thousands of Choctaw people sitting in the dark just waiting for the game to start, so, which is a really interesting thing about the fair that I won't go too much into here. But so anyways, it's kind of like a homecoming, cultural celebration, and a carnival all rolled into 1 week every July. And so it's a really big deal. And so I want to take the Choctaw Fair and use that kind of as a lens to look at markers of community affiliation and how do you represent that you're from Bogue Chitto or Beaver Dam or, you know, one of these communities. So one really obvious marker of what community you come from is your family name. So for instance, if your last name is Denson, there's a 99% chance that your family's from Standing Pine. That's kind of the way it is. Going back to what I was saying about the towns kind of being synonymous with Ixas or clans, you can kind of tell where somebody's from based on what their last name is. And so one thing that became really interesting as I was getting to know people in Mississippi, and the question always comes up of, well, are you part of Choctaw or what's going on? Why do you care about this stuff? Is I would mention that, oh yeah, on my mom's side, there's some Combies. And they, oh, Combies, oh yeah, I think we're probably cousins. And so that's how people relate to each other, is by knowing your family name and where you're from. And they can kind of put you into, well, like, oh, I see how you fit in now. So that was really important. And then also stickball team. So what stickball team you root for at the Choctaw Fair has very serious ramifications, and it means a lot. And so I brought some show and tell for you guys. And so as you'll notice, there's a similar color scheme on all of the stuff that I have up here. I represent Beaver Dam. That's my team. So stickball sticks, if you've never seen the game, these are stickball sticks or rackets, kapucha. And then this is the ball, the toa, and it's hand woven. It's a little leather hand woven ball. And you essentially trap the ball between the sticks, and then to throw it, you just open them up as you're moving it forward, and that's how you throw the ball. So anyways, you'll see especially kids and teenagers walking around all during the Choctaw Fair carrying a bag like this with their stickball sticks in there. And so the colors on here represent what team they're representing and who they play for usually. And then they always have the sticks with them. And so wherever they go during the fair, you see these little pickup games of stickball, like at night out in the parking lot or whatever. And it's really interesting kind of to watch how that works. A couple of other things related to stickball is most of the players will wear a headband. This is kind of the Choctaw style of sewing, where they make these diamonds and half diamond designs. And so like white on a red background represents Beaver Dam, like I said. And then another item that people will wear are these little guys, these little aprons. And so when they're playing stickball, usually sometimes they'll have an apron, sometimes they won't. And they'll have like a headband, and then they'll have their jersey. And so you can see in a couple of these slides here, you see these shirts that they're wearing. The tribe gets sponsorship from Pepsi, and so Pepsi provides all the team shirts. So, but you can tell what team somebody is just by looking at the shirt, because they represent these colors. And so these are just a couple of shots of some of these are old historic photos, you know, but this is the more recent time. So, like I was saying, so community colors are really important, and it goes beyond just stickball. So obviously, like I was saying, it's important in relation to the team colors for the stickball team that you represent. But the other thing too is that, so this is like kind of a traditional Choctaw shirt. This is what men wear. And so again, it's got the diamond design and it's white on red. So if somebody saw me wearing this, they would say, oh, well, you must be from Pearl River and you represent Beaver Dam. Because that's what this means if you see these colors. And so it's not just in the stickball uniforms and those kind of shirts. It's also in the other traditional clothes that you wear. So all the time you can be representing a certain community based on the colors that you choose to make your Choctaw shirt or dress. And so in this slide you can see a bunch of different Choctaw dresses. And here's one guy, but all the rest of them I think are women. And you see kind of the color schemes that are used. They're not, sometimes people use things that are not necessarily representing community colors, but they get into these kind of like mylar kind of things, and things are getting a little fancier with the Choctaw dresses now. But so these colors have significance is kind of the point that I'm trying to make. So for instance, like I said, Beaver Dam is white on red, Bokchitto is red on white. So if those colors are inverted, well, now that represents a whole different community. Chahta is white on blue, Tucker is yellow on green, and so forth and so on. So each of the communities have this kind of color scheme associated with the community. Oh, the other thing that I meant to mention about representing stickball teams at the fair too is they have these vendors, these booths that set up to do like the airbrush t-shirts that you can like tell them what to do and they'll make them right there. So you see tons of people all the time with like, you know, Bokchitto airbrush t-shirts, and that's real big. So you can look at the crowd and tell who's rooting for what team, like blatantly based on colors and then the shirts that they're wearing. So another marker of community affiliation that you see not only at the fair, but you know, that comes out at the fair as well, is linguistic dialects. So people will say, well, oh, I know what community you're from because of the way you speak. The way you speak Choctaw tells me where you're from. And so they say that they can tell where people are from by the way they speak. Also, in a similar vein, variations in the way people sing Choctaw chants, and also the steps that they do in the social dancing can indicate what community they're from. So like a lot of times in talking about singing and dancing, people specifically refer to Chahta as having this very distinctive style. So it's like, oh, well, you know he's from Chahta because of the way he's singing. You can tell. So here again, you've got some images of different singers and then also some of the different social dances being performed. So in that same vein, they also say that you can tell where a drummer's from or who he's representing by how he beats the drum. And so they say that each community, or at least in the past, that each community kind of had a distinctive drum beat that they would use so that you could tell, you know, which community they were from or what team they were representing. And so here you have a couple of images of drummers, some historic images. And then I put some of these in here too, just to show you what some of the old Choctaw uniforms for playing stickball used to look like back in the 70s. But again, you see them representing that same color scheme. You can tell what, like, you know that's Chahta, you know? So the other thing that I wanted to mention as well is that the Choctaw drums were used primarily to lead processions. So it's involved not only in stickball, which is kind of the main association, but also with dance performances or any kind of procession really. They usually are led by the Choctaw drum. And so I want to take just a second here and illustrate this point. I figured rather than just reading this quote from Jesse, I'd just let you guys hear it from him.
Yeah, also the drums that is played throughout the stickball game. They, I think, what I understand is that represents the heart of the creator that connects with the players. And they use a lot of what they call peach medicine, like voodoo or things of that nature. And they used to be strong in that. The Choctaws, I think, were strong in spirituality. And they frequent connections, and the drum was something of strength too. And you could hear the violins, and when one of the teams played, you would know when they scored a point by the sound of the drum. And I think people connected without actually being there. It was just, they were there too. They would say, we're winning. And just listen to the drum beat. And there are different ways the drummers beat from depending on the kind of beat. They had a way of telling which kind they were from. As well as language also. We had dialect levels. And you can say, yeah, from that point, it's just like there's a hidden message that we pick up from the language, from the songs.
So basically he just illustrated the points I was trying to make about the linguistic differences and then also the differences in the way people sing and the drum patterns. So in conclusion, why is this important? Well, I intend my work to provide a base for reflection for Mississippi Choctaw people to develop a greater understanding of what they recognize as traditional aspects of Choctaw culture and how these function within their own conceptions of their identity. So this is only a small part of my dissertation research, obviously, but I think it's important to look at these things. Also, using a grounded approach, I hope to offer my research utilizing the voices of typical MBCI tribal members as a means to critically investigate the way Choctaw culture is strategically used by the tribal government and programs. So rather than relying on how the tribal government defines Choctaw culture and traditions, I'm interested in what that means to the average MBCI tribal member. I think it's been a long time since they've done any kind of like going back and actually talking to people to say, well, hey, what cultural traditions are you afraid are getting lost, or what's going on? You know, what do you see as traditional? They've used this model for a long time of highlighting certain traditional arts, typically arts like basket making and medallion beating and things like that. But I think sometimes you lose some of the cultural values that are really important to the just average tribal members, things like the Iakoa. So I think it's really important to go back and actually talk to tribal members and try to use that more grounded approach. Or at least that's where I wanted to start from in doing my research. And so also, how does this research relate to my work for the tribe? So as some of you may know, while I was doing field work, I also worked for the Tribal Cultural Preservation Program. They hired me as a media and research specialist. So working for the tribe definitely informed my research and definitely led me kind of in certain directions. And part of what I tried to do was to identify institutions and programs that engaged and supported the activities defined as traditional, and tried to investigate their operations. And so how will my research be used? Well, at least this part of my research. Hopefully my research can also serve as an evaluation tool for the Cultural Preservation Program and can highlight Choctaw traditions that tribal members are concerned about and discuss how and why these traditional cultural practices are changing. This aspect of my research will also offer practical suggestions for the future cultural preservation efforts. So I think one of the really key things that I can do using my research is to go back and talk to the people running the cultural preservation program and say, hey, look, this is what people were telling me. You know, let's try to incorporate that into your planning and moving forward. So I think that's important. And I know the people that I worked with there are very interested in hearing about those things. So in conclusion, I would like to thank a few people. thank you all for coming, first and foremost. And again, thank you to the Anthropology Department and the Maxwell Museum Association for this award. I would also like to thank my dissertation committee, Beverly Singer, who's my chair, Les Field is on my committee, and Lloyd Lee and Joe Watkins also are on my committee. And I want to send Yakoke Chito a big thank you to the Mississippi Band of Choctaw Indians for allowing me to come and to do my research with the tribe, and to all my friends back in Mississippi for working with me and taking the time to sit down with me and teach me about some of these things and really develop these friendships that led to learning. And so I can't thank them enough for taking the time and the effort to do that. And then last but not least, I'd like to thank my wonderful partner Shima for always being there for me and helping me think through my research. She got to come down to Mississippi and see what was going on, and so she's been really helping me think through how to talk about these things. So with that, I think we'll open it up for some questions. Yeah.
Do you see this as a possible model for use by other tribes around the country to go in and maybe reassess or approach their
Well, I mean, I think it's going to work both ways, right? The cultural preservation program is very interested in learning from other tribes and how they've gone about, especially with language revitalization, because the Choctaw have always just had the language. Like, up until very recently, there was like 90% Choctaw fluency. So that's never really been a concern until fairly recently. But they've come out here to Santa Fe, actually, and gone to some workshops and stuff, looking at technologies for how to build online programs and things like that for language. But I think what's interesting that hopefully in my full dissertation I'll be able to talk about is looking at these larger and more long-term impacts of the economic development programs and seeing what has actually happened in Mississippi, or at least how tribal members think that that has affected or impacted the tribe. So hopefully that will lead to some recommendations and kind of things that maybe could inform policy decisions or could be models for other tribes too. Because economic development is not all good and it's not all bad. It's a mixed bag. It's much more complicated than the media would like you to believe, or tribal leaders oftentimes would like you to believe. So that's part of what I'm doing, is trying to critically look at what's actually happening. And so I think the tribal members are interested in talking about that too. I got a lot of talk from them. Yeah, Lee?
Given the changes that have occurred in Choctaw in the past 2 centuries, how much of the language reflected these changes, or is it still very much what it was pre-Choctaw?
Well, you know, that's a hard question, because there's not that great of resources for having the language recorded early. I mean, there is some stuff with the missionaries. I mean, the first time Choctaw was written was, you know, when they translated the Bible into Choctaw. So there are those old documents. And I think one of the things that's really happened with the language in Mississippi is because it's a living language, it's spoken daily by people, it's changed over time. And so one of the things that's really funny is when you have like an Oklahoma Choctaw person trying to speak Choctaw to a Mississippi Choctaw person, sometimes they don't understand each other, because it's like in Oklahoma they learn out of a book, and so they know like the very formal way of saying things. And then in Mississippi, half the time they cut words in half and stick them together. And so it makes it really difficult for them to understand what each other's saying, because they use this more formalized version of the language. And so I know for me, having learned Choctaw primarily through the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma, through the online classes and stuff, and then, you know, my practice on my own, when I got to Mississippi the first time, I had a very hard time understanding what people were saying, because they'd be combining 2 or 3 words into one, and I'd think it was some other word they were trying to say, and it gets really confusing unless you're used to the way they speak there. So I think that is definitely changed over time. It's because it's a living language and it's used. But then also the other thing that people talk about now is that, well, none of the kids now speak Choctaw. They all want to speak English first, you know. which, you know, historically, the Mississippi Choctaw had like the highest rates of native language fluency of, I mean, outside of the Navajo, maybe like one of the highest in the nation, really. So that's troubling to a lot of people that are my age and older, and they brought that up a lot. So that's something the Cultural Preservation Program and some of the other programs within the tribe are trying to figure out how to deal with. And then a lot of times people will say it's because the kids watch too much TV, and they want to imitate what they see on TV. So I don't know. Yeah. Yeah, it is. It is, but yeah, I mean the thing is the way it's what? Oh, is Choctaw language taught in the schools, in the tribal schools? And so I mean it is, but classes are usually held in English, right? So a lot of the people that I talked to that were, you know, middle-aged kind of, the first time they ever encountered English was in school. And that was back when it was the BIA schools before the tribe took over the school system. But I think still that's an issue, that they are taught in English primarily. And the way it used to be, they would learn Choctaw at home, and that would be their first language, and then they would go to school and learn English. But now, because of kind of how things are changing, there needs to be more emphasis on language. And they try to do that, like in the early childhood development stuff, like the Head Start programs. They're trying to do that. So they're aware of it. Yes?
What about intermarriage? Who are they marrying?
Right.
When they're marrying outside of the tribe?
Right, so that is a hot issue in Mississippi for various reasons. So it's a definite concern, right? Because the tribal enrollment criteria is half or full. So, you know, in some ways, I feel like some of the kids are sometimes pressured into marrying other Choctaw people, because it's like, well, if they're half already, if they don't, well, their kid's not going to be able to be enrolled and not going to be able to, you know, be included in some of the benefits that the tribe offers. So there's definitely, that's definitely an issue that comes up a lot in talking with people. And, you know, there's people intermixed, all kinds of, I mean, every possible combination you can think of in Mississippi. So you have people that are half African American, half Choctaw, half white, you know, half Choctaw, or some derivation or, you know, fraction of that. And it's definitely something that came up a few times as a issue of concern. Like, all our young girls are marrying all these guys from over there, and like they're gonna forget what it means to be Choctaw. So it's definitely something that came up a lot. And with the blood quantum requirements being what they are there, it really makes it kind of a very intense situation sometimes. And the funny thing about it is, if you go back and look at the historical record, I mean, the people that were the tribal leaders, like the Minkos back in the, you know, like 1800s, you know, early 1900s, were like 1/32 Choctaw. Like, that wasn't even an issue. They didn't think of blood quantum. Like, that's not a Choctaw idea. That's a federal government idea. So, so that's what I was talking about earlier with like what Eva Garet's talking about, is looking at alternative models for thinking about identity and getting away from this blood quantum fracturing, conquer and divide kind of system. So, yeah, but it is a big issue there, for sure.
Do they use the clan system for marriage and things?
Well, so basically kind of how it is now is they basically kind of equate what town you're from to your clan. So if you're from Tucker or Bokchitto or Conahata.
How many clans are there?
Well, so there's the 8 communities, and that's kind of seen as the clans, because that's really the only reference to Ixar clan that's used now is kind of like, well, you can't marry somebody from Crystal Ridge because you're from there. You got to go find a girl from Bokchitto. So, you know, that kind of thing. It's kind of how the clan system sort of still works now. Yeah, Luis? Depends on who you talk to. It depends on who you talk to. Like some people say patrilineal, some say matrilineal. If you look at the historic records and you look at like John Swanton's books and stuff, he says they're matrilineal. But then when you talk to people in Mississippi, they say, "Ah, oh, he made that up. We're patrilineal." So I mean, I don't know. It's really kind of hard to tell. Certainly something that did happen though in the 1900s, right before removal. So Choctaw removal was they were the first tribe to be removed to Indian territory. That's why it's called Oklahoma. That just means red people in Choctaw. So right before removal though, the Choctaw Nation passed a constitution, and they made inheritance through the male line, and they offered the rights of private property, and they tried to model themselves after the American government in a lot of ways, because they thought maybe if we act like we're like them, maybe they'll let us stay, you know. So that was a intentional practice or a conscious decision. So I don't know if maybe some people are thinking back to that kind of thing and thinking they were always patrilineal.
So are you supposed to marry somebody not in your own community?
Yeah, in general.
Does it matter where you live in her community or his community?
Well, now that is something that, the guy that was speaking in the video clip, Jesse Ben says, how's he say it? He was like, I didn't even think about it, but like when I married my wife, I just naturally went to live in her community. And he was like, well, thinking back about it, well, maybe I did that and I didn't even realize that we're matrilineal, and that's why, or matrilocal, and that's why I did it. So it's interesting because you have some of the Choctaw people that I worked with, are very highly educated, and they've read all the history books on Choctaw history. They've read it more than probably anybody else has, and they know, and they talk about these things that way. So especially like Dan Isaac and some of those guys, like they'll refer back to John Swanton, and like Bureau of American Ethnologists stuff to validate some of what they're doing now. It's very interesting.